Some mistakes follow you home, no matter how far you run or how many years pass. In the dusty town of Dust Creek, Sheriff Tom Bradley thought he'd buried his past deep enough that it would never surface again. When he finds a ragged little girl, wandering alone near a derailed train, she won't speak or give her name. He places her in an empty jail cell, hoping someone will come looking for her. That night she begins to sing a haunting lullaby about fire, running, and a man with a crooked star who never came back. The sheriff recognizes the song. It tells the story of a night 20 years ago when he was part of a posse that made a terrible mistake. A mistake that destroyed an innocent family. A mistake he's carried like a stone in his chest ever since. Now this little girl's song is drawing the whole town to listen, and the truth he's kept buried is clawing its way to the surface. But will facing his past finally bring him peace, or destroy the life he's built on lies? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted Dust Creek in shades of amber and gold, the same way it had for the past 20 years Tom Bradley had worn the sheriff's badge. He stood on the wooden porch of his office, coffee steaming in his weathered hands, watching the town come alive with the familiar rhythm of frontier life. At 58, his hair had gone mostly grey, and the lines around his eyes spoke of too many hard decisions and sleepless nights. The badge on his chest caught the early light, its surface dulled by time and wear. Most folks didn't notice the small dent in the corner where it had taken a bullet years back, but Tom's fingers found it unconsciously whenever he was thinking hard about something. Like now, as he considered the strange little girl sleeping in his jail cell. She couldn't be more than 10 years old, though the hard living had aged her face beyond her years. When he'd found her yesterday evening, she'd been sitting beside the twisted metal of the derailed supply train like she was waiting for someone who would never come. Her clothes were patched and repatched, her feet bare and tough as leather, and she clutched a worn felt hat that had seen better days. Most unsettling of all, she wouldn't speak. Not her name. Not where she came from, not what had happened to her family. Tom had dealt with lost children before. Usually within a day or two, frantic parents would ride into town, or he'd get word from neighboring settlements. But something about this girl felt different. There was an old sadness in her eyes, the kind that came from seeing too much, too young. When he'd tried to take the hat from her to examine it, she'd held on with such fierce desperation that he'd given up. Whatever that hat meant to her, it was all she had left in the world. The jail cell wasn't really a proper place for a child, but Dust Creek didn't have many options. Doc Williams had offered to take her in, but the girl had seemed more comfortable in the familiar confines of the small cell than in the doctor's well-appointed home. She'd curled up on the narrow cot like a wounded animal finding the safest corner, and Tom had left the cell door unlocked, though she hadn't tried to leave. "Morning, Sheriff." Martha Caldwell's voice interrupted his thoughts. The saloon keeper was already up and about, sweeping the dust from her front steps with the methodical precision of someone who'd been running a business for 15 years. At 45, Martha was one of the few people in town who remembered Dust Creek when it was just a collection of tents and hope. She'd built her establishment from nothing, and her word carried weight in the community. "Morning, Martha. Early start today?" "Could ask you the same thing." She leaned on her broom, studying his face with the sharp eyes that had made her successful in a business where reading people was essential for survival. "Heard you had some excitement yesterday. Word is you've got a little guest." Tom nodded, unsurprised that news had traveled. In a town of 300 souls, keeping secrets was like trying to hold water in a sieve. Found her by the train wreck. No family in sight, won't say a word about where she comes from. Poor little thing. Martha's expression softened. "She got a name. If she does, she's not sharing it. Doc Williams looked her over. Says she's healthy enough, just scared and tired. Figures someone will come looking for her soon enough. But even as he said it, Tom felt a nagging doubt. Something about the girl's haunted expression suggested she wasn't waiting for rescue. She was hiding from something or someone. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the main street, where Mayor Fletcher was arriving for what Tom suspected would be an early morning inquiry about their unexpected guest. Harold Fletcher was a good man who genuinely cared about the town's welfare, but he worried constantly about Dust Creek's reputation. In his mind, every incident was a potential threat to the community's carefully built stability. "Tom," Fletcher called out, dismounting with the careful movements of a man whose riding days were mostly behind him. "Heard about the child? Any word from neighboring towns?" "Not yet. Sent telegrams yesterday to Millfield and Cedar Ridge. Should hear back today if anyone's missing a daughter." Fletcher nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "And if no one comes forward, then we figure out what's best for her." Tom's voice carried a finality that discouraged further questions, but Fletcher pressed on. "The territorial authorities will want to know about this. An abandoned child, no family, no explanation. It could reflect poorly on our community's ability to maintain order." Tom felt his jaw tighten. In Fletcher's world, everything came down to how it might affect Dust Creek's standing with the territorial government. The man meant well, but sometimes his priorities rankled. "She's not abandoned, Harold. She's lost. There's a difference." Before Fletcher could respond, a soft sound drifted from the jail building. It was barely audible, but it made all three adults freeze and listen. The girl was humming, a low, mournful tune that seemed to carry on the morning air like smoke from a distant fire. "What is that?" Martha whispered. Tom felt something cold settle in his stomach. The melody was familiar, though he couldn't place where he'd heard it before. It was the kind of tune that stuck in your memory without permission, simple enough to remember but haunting enough to disturb your sleep. "I'll check on her," he said, but as he moved toward the jail, the humming stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Inside the small building, Tom found the girl sitting on the edge of the cot, the worn hat in her lap. She looked up when he entered, and for a moment he saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten. It wasn't fear or confusion. It was recognition, as if she knew something about him that he'd forgotten about himself. "You hungry, child?" he asked gently. "Martha makes the best flapjacks this side of the territory." The girl studied his face for a long moment, her gaze lingering on his badge. When she finally shook her head, it was with the solemnity of someone far older than her years. Tom found himself reaching into his vest pocket, where he kept a small leather journal. It was a habit he'd developed years ago, writing down thoughts and observations that seemed too heavy to carry around in his head. Lately, most of his entries had been about the dreams that woke him in the middle of the night. Dreams filled with fire and screaming and the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. He'd never told anyone about the journal, just as he'd never told anyone about the real reason he'd come to Dust Creek 20 years ago. Sometimes a man's past was best left buried, especially when digging it up might hurt people who didn't deserve to suffer for old mistakes. But looking at this silent, watchful child, Tom felt the familiar ache in his chest that meant his past was stirring, like an old wound that ached before a storm. He had the unsettling feeling that his carefully constructed life was about to be tested in ways he wasn't prepared for. Outside, he could hear Martha and Fletcher discussing arrangements for the girl's care, their voices mixing with the everyday. Sounds of a town going about its business, but inside the jail, the silence stretched between Tom and the child like a bridge waiting to be crossed. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly, not really expecting an answer. "Someone I knew a long time ago." The girl's fingers tightened on her hat, and for just a moment Tom thought he saw her lips move as if she were about to speak. But then the moment passed, and she was just a lost child again, waiting for whatever came next. Tom closed the journal and slipped it back into his pocket. Whatever secrets this girl carried, whatever brought her to Dust Creek, he had a feeling his own buried past was about to become very relevant, and that scared him more than he cared to admit. As he turned to leave, the girl began humming again, so softly he almost missed it. But this time, listening more carefully, Tom felt his blood run cold. He knew that tune. He knew it because he'd heard it before, on a night 20 years ago, when everything had gone terribly, impossibly wrong. The night when Tom Bradley had helped destroy an innocent family and learned that some mistakes follow you no matter how far you run. That evening, as shadows lengthened across Dust Creek's main street, Tom sat in his office chair with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The girl had eaten a little of the dinner Martha had brought over, but she'd remained silent, watching him with those knowing eyes that seemed to see too much. The telegraph responses had come back negative. No missing children reported in Millfield or Cedar Ridge, no families searching for a lost daughter. It was as if the girl had appeared from nowhere, with no past and no one looking for her future. Tom was considering his next move when the humming started again. But this time, it was different, stronger, more deliberate. The simple melody filled the small jail building, and Tom felt the coffee cup slip from his numb fingers. He knew that song. As if drawn by an invisible thread, Tom found himself walking to the cell. The girl sat cross-legged on the cot, her eyes closed, the worn hat pressed against her chest. The melody continued low and mournful, but then something changed. Words began to emerge, soft as whispered prayers. Papa ran when the fire came high. Mama screamed, but the starman lied little. Boots in the morning dew, starman promised, but never came true. Tom's hand flew to his badge, fingers finding the familiar dent in the corner. The Starman! Dear God, she was singing about him. The girl's voice continued, each verse like a knife turning in his chest. House went up in the orange light, Papa. Called out in the long, dark night. Starman rode with his posse strong, but Papa was right and they were wrong. Outside, Tom could hear voices gathering. The girl's singing had drawn attention, and people were collecting on the porch and in the street. Martha's voice, Doc Williams calling out questions, Mayor Fletcher demanding to know what was happening, but Tom couldn't move. He was frozen in place, watching this child, this impossible, devastating child, sing the story of the worst night of his life. Mama held me when the roof came down. Papa never made it out of town. Starman's badge caught the firelight. Wrong was wrong, but they made it right. The melody faded, but the girl's eyes opened, and she looked directly at Tom. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, the first words she'd said since he found her. "You killed my papa." The simple statement hit Tom like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his mind reeling with memories he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. The Hartwell homestead, the midnight raid, the screaming, the fire. "No," he whispered, but even as he said it, he knew it was a lie, or at least not the whole truth. The girl, Emma, her name was Emma Hartwell, he remembered now, stood up on the cot, still clutching her father's hat. "Papa was Jacob Hartwell," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years of grief. "Mama was Mary. They didn't do nothing wrong, but you and your men came anyway. You burned our house. You killed my family." Tom's legs gave out, and he sank into the chair by his desk. The memories flooded back with brutal clarity. September 1865. Samuel Crenshaw had come to town with a story about homesteaders harboring outlaws, said they were dangerous men using the Hartwell place as a hideout. The territorial marshal had deputized a posse, and Tom had been eager to serve, young and convinced he was fighting for justice. They'd surrounded the cabin at night. called for the outlaws to surrender. When Jake Hartwell had appeared in the doorway, confused and frightened, demanding to know what was happening, someone had fired. Tom couldn't remember who. Maybe it had been him. The shooting had started the fire somehow, or maybe one of the posse had thrown a torch. In the chaos and smoke, details had blurred together, but he remembered Jake Hartwell's voice calling out that there were no outlaws, that it was just him and his family. He remembered the screaming from inside the burning cabin. When it was over, they'd found Jake's body and pulled out Mary Hartwell, burned and dying. She'd lived long enough to tell them there had been a daughter, but they'd never found the child. The posse had assumed she'd died in the fire, her body consumed by the flames, but she hadn't died. Somehow, impossibly, Emma Hartwell had survived. And now she was here, 20 years later, singing the song that would expose the truth Tom had buried. Outside, the crowd was growing larger. Tom could hear Martha asking questions, Doc Williams calling for calm. Through the window, he could see faces pressed against the glass, people straining to hear what was happening inside the jail. Emma continued to stare at him, her small face set with determination that reminded him achingly of her father. "The song?" Tom managed to ask. "Where did you learn it?" "Mama taught it to me," Emma said. "Before she died. She made me promise to remember it, to sing it so people would know what really happened. She said someday I'd find the Star Man, and I'd make him tell the truth." Tom's badge felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The dent in the corner, he remembered now. A piece of burning wood had struck it during the fire. A mark he'd carried for 20 years, never realizing it was evidence of his participation in a terrible mistake. "Emma," he said, his voice breaking, we all thought, you thought Papa was hiding bad men," she said. "But he wasn't. Papa was good. He helped people. He never hurt nobody." The truth of it crashed over Tom like a wave. They'd been wrong, completely, devastatingly wrong. And by the time they'd realized their mistake, the Hartwell family was dead. Or so they'd believed. "How did you survive?" he asked. "Root cellar," Emma said simply. "Papa made me hide when he heard the horses coming. I stayed down there while the house burned. When I came up, everything was gone. Mama was still alive, but just barely. She told me to run, to hide, to remember the song." Tom felt 20 years of guilt crushing down on him. All this time, he'd told himself they'd been deceived, that they'd acted in good faith on bad information. He'd built a life on the foundation of that rationalization. But looking at this child, this living reminder of his failure, he knew there was no excuse that could wash away what they'd done. Outside, Martha's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. Tom, what's happening in there? Who is this child?" Emma looked toward the door, then back at Tom. "Tell them," she said. "Tell them what you did. Tell them about Papa." Tom's hands were shaking as he reached for his badge. The metal felt cold and heavy, tarnished by years of carrying a lie. He could walk outside right now and tell the crowd that the girl was confused, traumatized, making up stories. He could maintain the fiction that had protected him for 2 decades, or he could face the truth that had finally come home. Emma began, singing again, her clear voice carrying through the walls. Starman's badge caught the firelight. Wrong was wrong, but they made it right. But little girls remember true, and someday stars must pay what's due. Through the window, Tom could see the faces of his neighbors, people who trusted him, respected him, counted on him to keep them safe. In a few minutes, he would have to walk outside and admit that their sheriff was a man who'd helped murder an innocent family. But first, he had to look this brave, broken child in the eye and say the words he should have said 20 years ago. "Emma Hartwell," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. God help me. I am so sorry." Emma nodded once, still holding her father's hat. "Now tell everyone else." Tom didn't sleep that night. He sat at his desk until dawn, staring at the worn leather journal in his hands, trying to find the courage to write down what Emma's song had awakened in his memory. Outside, he could hear the murmur of voices as word spread through Dust Creek like wildfire. The little girl in the jail was claiming their sheriff had killed her family 20 years ago. Some people would dismiss it as the confused ramblings of a traumatized child. Others would demand answers. But Tom knew that regardless of what anyone else believed, he could no longer carry the weight of his secret alone. When the first light crept through his office window, Tom made a decision that would change everything. He needed to know the truth, all of it. Not just what he remembered through the haze of 20-year-old guilt, but the facts, the real story of what had happened to the Hartwell family. He locked the jail office and walked through the quiet streets to the courthouse where the territorial records were kept in a dusty room that smelled of old paper and regret. If Jake Hartwell had been a legitimate homesteader, there would be records. A land deed, settlement papers, something that would prove he'd been an innocent man trying to build a life for his family. The filing system was haphazard at best, but Tom had time and motivation. He pulled down box after box, searching through marriage licenses, property transfers, and settlement records until his fingers found what he was looking for. A homestead deed dated March 15th, 1863, granting 160 acres to Jacob Hartwell, late of Kansas Territory. Tom's hands trembled as he read the document. Jake Hartwell had filed his claim properly, paid his fees, and met all the requirements for legal settlement. More than that, the deed included character references from 3 different Kansas lawmen, attesting to Hartwell's good standing and honest reputation. At the bottom of the deed, a notation in different handwriting caught Tom's eye. Water rights. Disputed by S. Crenshaw. Matter resolved in favor of Hartwell. December 1864. Samuel Crenshaw, the man who had come to town with the story about outlaws hiding at the Hartwell place. The man whose information had led to the raid that destroyed Emma's family. Tom felt his stomach turn as the pieces began to fall into place. Crenshaw had wanted the Hartwell land, specifically the water rights. When legal challenges had failed, he'd found another way to get what he wanted. The courthouse clock was chiming 8 when Tom finally left the records room, the homestead deed folded carefully in his pocket. He knew where he needed to go next, but first he had to check on Emma. Found her sitting quietly in the cell, drawing pictures on a piece of paper Doc Williams must have brought her. The drawings were simple but devastating. A house on fire, stick figures running, men on horses. In one corner, she'd carefully drawn a star. "Emma," Tom said gently, "I found something you should see." He showed her the homestead deed, explaining what it meant in terms a child could understand. Emma listened solemnly, then nodded as if she'd known all along that her father had been an honest man. "Papa always said we had the right to be there," she said. "He said the bad man wanted our water, but it belonged to us fair and square." "The bad man," Tom repeated. "Was his name Crenshaw?" Emma's face darkened. "That's him. He came around sometimes, trying to scare Papa into leaving. Papa never budged, though, said we had paper that proved it was our home." Doc Williams arrived just then, carrying a tray of breakfast and a concerned expression. "Tom, the whole town's talking. People are asking questions. Some folks are saying the girl's confused, making up stories. Others are wondering if there's truth to what she's claiming." Tom studied the doctor's kind face. Doc Williams was one of the few people in Dust Creek who had known Tom since the early days. If anyone deserved to hear the truth first, it was him. "Doc, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you remember anything about a homestead fire, maybe 20 years back? Family named Hartwell?" Doc's expression grew thoughtful. "Hartwell? That name is familiar. Wasn't there some trouble out at one of the remote claims? I seem to recall treating some burns, though the details are fuzzy." "You treated Mary Hartwell," Emma said quietly. "Mama told me about the kind doctor who tried to help her before she died." Doc's face went pale. "Dear God, you're saying but that's impossible. The child died in the fire. Everyone said so." "Everyone was wrong," Tom said. "Doc, I need to ride out to the old Hartwell place. There might be things there that could help us understand what really happened." "I'll come with you," Doc said immediately. "If this child is telling the truth about who she is—" "She is," Tom interrupted. "I know she is." The ride to the abandoned homestead took the better part of 2 hours, following old wagon trails that had been overgrown by 20 years of neglect. When they finally reached the site, Tom felt his chest constrict with recognition and remorse. The foundation stones of the original cabin were still visible beneath the tangle of weeds and wild growth. Scattered among the vegetation were the remnants of a life destroyed, fragments of pottery, rusted tools, the twisted remains of what had once been a water pump. "Over there," Emma said, pointing to a depression in the ground near what had been the back of the house. "That's where the root cellar was, where I hid." Tom and Doc walked to the spot Emma indicated. Sure enough, beneath the undergrowth, they could make out the remains of a small underground storage area. It would have been just large enough for a child to hide in, and deep enough to provide protection from fire and smoke. As they explored the site, Tom found other evidence of the life the Hartwells had built: the remains of a chicken coop, a small garden plot still visible despite the years, and near the creek, the foundation stones of what looked like it had been a mill wheel. "They were farmers," Doc said wonderingly. "This was a working homestead, not a hideout for outlaws." "Papa grew the best corn in 3 counties," Emma said proudly, "and he helped other folks too. When the Petersons' crops failed, Papa gave them grain to get through the winter. When old Mr. Murphy got sick, Papa helped with his livestock." Tom felt each word like a nail in his coffin. Jake Hartwell hadn't just been innocent. He'd been a good man, a pillar of his small community. And Tom had helped destroy him based on the lies of a greedy land grabber. Near the creek, half hidden under years of fallen leaves, Tom found something that made his blood run cold. It was a small headstone, roughly carved but carefully placed. The inscription was simple: "Mary Hartwell, beloved wife and mother, 1829 to 1865. "I come here sometimes," Emma said quietly, "to talk to Mama. I told her I'd find the Starman someday and I'd make him remember." Tom knelt beside the grave, hat in hand. "Emma, I'm going to make this right. I don't know how yet, but I swear to you, I'm going to make this right." Emma looked at him with those old, sad eyes. "Making it right means telling everyone what really happened. All of it, even the parts that hurt." As they prepared to leave the homestead, Tom took one last look around the ruins of the Hartwell family's dreams. Tomorrow, he would have to face the rest of Dust Creek with the truth. But first, he had to find the courage to face himself. The burnt doll lay in Tom's hands like a piece of broken history. He'd found it tucked beneath the collapsed stones of what had been the Hartwell cabin's chimney, protected from the weather by chance and time. The fabric was charred and faded, but the basic shape was still recognizable: a small cloth doll with button eyes and yarn hair that had once been golden. Emma's reaction when he showed it to her was immediate and heartbreaking. Her composed facade cracked, and for the first time since he'd found her, she looked like the child she truly was. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she reached for the doll with trembling hands. "Rosie," she whispered. "Mama made her for me. I thought she was gone forever." Doc Williams, who had become Emma's unofficial caretaker, watched with professional concern as the girl clutched the damaged toy to her chest. But Tom recognized what was happening. The doll was a bridge between Emma's buried childhood and her present reality, and crossing that bridge was going to be painful. "Tell me about Rosie," Tom said gently, settling into the chair beside Emma's cot. Emma's voice was barely audible. "Mama sewed her from scraps of our old dresses. She said every little girl needed someone to talk to when the world got too big and scary. I was supposed to take her to the root cellar with me, but I forgot. When I went back to look for her after the fire, everything was gone." The guilt in her voice cut Tom to the bone. This child had been carrying the weight of 20 years' worth of survivor's guilt, believing she'd somehow failed by forgetting a doll while her world burned down around her. "Emma," he said carefully, "you were just a little girl. There was nothing you could have done differently." But Emma shook her head. "I should have saved her. Mama always said to take care of the things we love." Tom felt his own guilt twist tighter in his chest. While Emma had been torturing herself over a forgotten doll, he'd been building a life on the foundation of collective amnesia. The unfairness of it was staggering. Over the next few days, as word of Emma's story spread through Dust Creek, Tom began to see the fractures forming in his community. Some people, like Martha and Doc Williams, accepted Emma's account without question. They'd seen her reaction to the doll, heard the pain in her voice when she talked about her parents, and recognized the unmistakable ring of truth. Others, however, were less convinced. Mayor Fletcher worried about the implications for the town's reputation. Several of the older residents, including some who remembered the original incident, questioned why Emma had waited 20 years to come forward. A few suggested she might be a confidence artist, using old tragedy to manipulate the community's sympathies. The doubt hurt Emma more than Tom had expected. She'd lived her entire life knowing the truth about her family's death, believing that someday justice would be possible. To have that truth questioned and dismissed was almost more than she could bear. "Maybe they're right," she said one evening, as Tom found her sitting on the jail porch, holding Rosie and staring at the sunset. "Maybe I should just leave, find somewhere else to go." "Where would you go?" Tom asked, settling beside her on the wooden steps. Emma was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. I've been moving from town to town for years, looking for the Starman, looking for you. Now that I've found you, I'm not sure what comes next." The casual revelation hit Tom like a physical blow. "You've been searching for me all this time?" Emma nodded. "Mama told me about the badge with the bent corner. She saw it when you were kneeling by the fire, trying to help people get out. She made me promise to remember that detail, because someday I might need to identify the good Starman from the bad ones." The good Starman. Tom's voice cracked. "Mama said not all of the posse men were evil. She said some of them tried to help once they realized what was really happening. She saw you pulling people away from the fire, trying to get them to safety. She said you were crying." Tom closed his eyes, memory flooding back. He had tried to help. When it became clear that Jake Hartwell was telling the truth about there being no outlaws, when the fire had started and Mary Hartwell's screams had filled the night air, Tom had tried desperately to undo what couldn't be undone. He'd pulled, burning timbers aside, shouted for water, done everything he could think of to save the family they'd mistakenly attacked. But it hadn't been enough. Jake was already dead, and Mary died despite Doc Williams' efforts to treat her burns. The other members of the posse had been eager to put the whole ugly incident behind them, especially when Samuel Crenshaw had quietly left town the next day. "I should have done more," Tom said. "I should have spoken up afterward, demanded an investigation." "You were young," Emma said with wisdom beyond her years. "Mama said you looked young. She said young men sometimes do bad things when older men tell them it's right." The forgiveness in her voice was almost harder to bear than accusation would have been. Tom had spent 20 years expecting to be punished for his role in the Hartwell tragedy. He'd never imagined that the surviving victim might offer him understanding instead of revenge. "What do you want from me, Emma?" he asked. "What would make this right for you?" Emma was quiet for a long time, absent-mindedly smoothing Rosie's singed yarn hair. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "I want people to know that Papa was a good man. I want them to know he didn't do anything wrong. And I want them to know that what happened to my family was wrong, so maybe it won't happen to other families. And what about me? What do you want to happen to me?" Emma looked at him with those ancient, sorrowful eyes. "I want you to tell the truth, all of it, even the parts that hurt. Because lies hurt more than truth does, and they hurt for longer." That night, Tom sat at his desk with his journal open before him. For the first time in 20 years, he began to write the whole story of what had happened at the Hartwell homestead. Every detail he could remember, every moment of that terrible night, every day of guilt that had followed. When he finished, hours later, his hand was cramped, and his heart felt both heavier and lighter than it had in decades. Emma was right. The truth hurt, but lies hurt worse, and they hurt for longer. Now came the hardest part, deciding what to do with the truth he'd finally acknowledged. Outside, Dust Creek slept peacefully, unaware that their sheriff was preparing to shatter the comfortable fiction that had protected them all for 20 years. But in the jail cell, Emma slept clutching her rescued doll, and for the first time since Tom had found her, she looked truly peaceful. Perhaps the truth, no matter how painful, was worth that peace. The forged letter sat before Tom like a smoking gun, its yellowed edges and faded ink telling a story of calculated deception. He'd found it buried in a box of old territorial correspondence, filed away and forgotten in the courthouse basement. But the signature at the bottom made his blood run cold. Samuel Crenshaw, concerned citizen, reporting suspicious activity at the Hartwell homestead. Tom read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of manipulation. Crenshaw claimed to have witnessed armed men coming and going from the Hartwell property at odd hours. He described cache of weapons supposedly hidden in the cabin's root cellar. Most damning of all, he provided specific dates and times for alleged meetings between Jake Hartwell and known criminals from the territory. It was all lies, Tom realized. Elaborate, detailed, convincing lies designed to paint an innocent farmer as a dangerous criminal. And 20 years ago, a young deputy sheriff had believed every word. Emma found him in the courthouse that morning, her bare feet silent on the wooden floors. She'd taken to wandering around Dust Creek freely now, and most of the townspeople had grown accustomed to seeing the small, serious girl who spoke little but observed everything. "You found something," she said, studying his face. Tom showed her the letter, explaining what it meant. Emma listened without speaking, but her small hands clenched into fists as the implications became clear. "He planned it," she said finally. "The bad man planned to kill my family. Emma, there's something else, something I need to tell you about that night." Emma's eyes met his, and Tom saw steel beneath the childhood vulnerability. This girl had survived 20 years on her own strength. She could handle whatever truth he had to share. "Your father tried to tell us," Tom said quietly. "When we surrounded the cabin, he came out with his hands up, trying to explain that there were no outlaws, that it was just his family. But we didn't listen. We were so convinced we were right, so sure Crenshaw's information was accurate." Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "What happened then?" "Someone fired a shot. I don't know who. In the confusion and darkness, everything went wrong so fast. Your father tried to get back to the cabin, to protect you and your mother. That's when the fire started." Tom's hands shook as he remembered the chaos of that night. "I tried to stop it, Emma. Once I realized what was happening, I tried to get the men to cease fire, to help put out the flames, but it was too late." Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing this new information. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed impossible for someone so young. "Papa died trying to save us." "Yes, he was a brave man, Emma. A good man who died protecting his family." Emma reached into the pocket of her worn dress and pulled out something Tom hadn't seen before. A small, tarnished silver locket. With careful fingers, she opened it to reveal a tiny photograph of a man, woman, and child standing in front of a cabin. "This is us," she said simply, "before everything burned." Tom studied the photograph, seeing Jake Hartwell clearly for the first time as a person rather than a memory clouded by guilt and time. He was a tall, honest-looking man with kind eyes and calloused hands. Mary Hartwell was beautiful in the way of frontier women, strong, determined, with laugh lines around her eyes. And between them stood a small girl with Emma's serious expression, who clutching what looked like the same doll Tom had found in the ruins. "Where did you get this?" Tom asked. "Mama gave it to me in the root cellar, before she made me promise to hide until the danger was over. She said it was so I'd always remember what our family looked like when we were happy." The photograph was proof of Emma's identity beyond any reasonable doubt. More than that, it was evidence of the life that had been destroyed by Crenshaw's lies and the posse's blind acceptance of those lies. "Emma, this locket proves who you are, but it also proves something else, that your family deserves justice." Emma closed the locket carefully and held it against her chest. "What kind of justice?" Before Tom could answer, Martha's voice called from the courthouse entrance. "Tom, Emma, you two in here?" They found Martha in the main hall, looking agitated. Behind her stood Frank Morrison, one of the men Tom hadn't seen in years but recognized. Immediately, Frank had been part of the original posse, one of the younger men who'd followed orders without question. "Frank," Tom said carefully, "it's been a long time." Frank Morrison had aged well, his success as a rancher evident in his fine clothes and confident bearing. But his face was pale, and his eyes kept darting to Emma with obvious discomfort. "Tom, I heard rumors about this girl making claims about the old Hartwell situation. I thought it was time we talked." Emma stepped forward, and Tom saw Frank flinch slightly. "You were there," she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, I was part of the posse, but we were following orders, acting on information from the bad man," Emma interrupted, "from the man who wanted our land." Frank's composure cracked. "Look, we all felt terrible about what happened, but it was an accident, a tragic misunderstanding. Jake Hartwell's death was never intentional." "What about Mama's death?" Emma asked quietly. "Was that an accident too?" Frank had no answer for that. Martha stepped forward, her expression fierce. "Frank Morrison, this child has been through enough. If you can't speak truth to her, then you best keep your mouth shut entirely." "The truth," Frank said desperately, "is that we were young men doing what we thought was right based on the information we had. We can't change what happened 20 years ago." Tom felt something crystallize inside him. Frank was right that they couldn't change the past. But they could choose what to do with the truth now that it had finally surfaced. "Frank, did you know that Crenshaw's information was fabricated? Did you know he forged the letter that led to the raid?" Frank's face went white. "That's impossible. Crenshaw was a respected citizen. He had no reason to lie." Tom showed him the letter, watching as Frank read it with growing horror. "He had water rights to gain, Frank. The Hartwell homestead sat on the best water source in the territory. Crenshaw wanted that land, and when he couldn't get it legally, he found another way." Emma watched this exchange with the patience of someone who had waited 20 years for this moment. When Frank finished reading, she spoke with quiet dignity. "The truth is, Mr. Morrison, that you helped kill innocent people because a bad man. I told you lies, and now you get to decide whether you're brave enough to admit it." Frank looked at the photograph in Emma's locket, at the forged letter in Tom's hands, at the living proof that their tragic misunderstanding had been nothing less than murder by proxy. "Dear God," he whispered, "what have we done?" It was the First crack in the wall of silence that had protected the surviving posse members for 20 years, and Emma, standing small but unafraid in the courthouse hallway, had driven the wedge that would finally split it open. The locket's tiny clasp opened with a soft click, revealing not just the family photograph, but something else Emma had never shown anyone before. A second compartment containing a small folded paper. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, revealing her mother's handwriting, faded but still legible. "Mama wrote this for me before she died," Emma said, her voice barely audible. "She made me promise to keep it safe until I found the Starman." Tom took the paper with reverent care, reading Mary Hartwell's final words. "To whoever finds my daughter Emma, her father Jake was U.S. Marshal Jacob Hartwell, working under territorial authority to investigate land fraud. The men who killed him believed lies told by Samuel Crenshaw. My husband was a good man, trying to stop bad men from stealing from honest settlers. Emma is his legacy. Please see that justice is done. Mary Catherine Hartwell, September 1865. The world seemed to stop spinning. Tom read the note 3 times, each word hitting him like a physical blow. Jake Hartwell hadn't just been an innocent homesteader, he'd been a lawman, a federal marshal working to expose the very corruption that had led to his death. "Your father was a marshal," Tom said, his voice filled with awe and horror. Emma nodded solemnly. "Papa didn't tell many people because his work was dangerous. But Mama said it was important for me to know that Papa wore a star too, just like you do. He was one of the good star men." Doc Williams, who had joined them in the courthouse, sank heavily into a chair. "Dear God in heaven, we didn't just kill an innocent man. We killed a federal officer." The implications crashed over Tom like a wave. Everything they thought they knew about that night was wrong. Jake Hartwell hadn't been harboring criminals, he'd been investigating them. The suspicious activity Crenshaw had reported was probably Jake's investigation into Crenshaw's own illegal activities. "Emma," Tom said carefully, "do you know what your father was investigating?" "Land stealing," Emma said simply. "Papa said there were bad men taking homesteads away from honest folks by lying to the law. He was trying to prove it so the territorial government could stop them." Tom felt the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. Jake Hartwell had been building a case against Samuel Crenshaw and his associates. Crenshaw, realizing he was under investigation, had turned the tables by accusing the marshal of harboring outlaws. It was a brilliant, devastating strategy that had eliminated the threat to his operation, while making the lawman's death look like justifiable action. "We need to see the marshal's office records," Doc Williams said. "If Jake Hartwell was working an official investigation, there should be documentation." But Emma shook her head. "Papa kept his real papers hidden. He said if the bad men found out he was a marshal, they might try to hurt our family." Her voice broke. "They hurt us anyway." Tom's hands clenched into fists. The scope of Crenshaw's evil was staggering. He hadn't just murdered a family for their land. He'd assassinated a federal officer and manipulated local law enforcement into doing it for him. "Where did your father hide his papers?" Tom asked. Emma looked uncertain for the first time since he'd known her. "I was little. I remember Papa had a special place, but I'm not sure I could find it again." Martha, who had been listening in stunned silence, finally spoke up. "Emma, child, you've carried this burden alone for 20 years. You don't have to remember everything perfectly. We'll help you figure it out." Over the next several hours, Emma led them back to the ruins of the Hartwell homestead. This time, they searched more systematically, looking for any hiding place a cautious federal marshal might have used to conceal sensitive documents. Emma wandered the overgrown site like a ghost returning to haunt her former life. Papa used to walk around out here in the evenings, checking things. He said a man had to know every inch of his land to protect it proper. Tom watched her pause beside the old well, her small face scrunched in concentration. "The well," she said suddenly. "Papa always said the well was the most important part of any homestead. Control the water, control the land," he used to say. They lowered a lantern into the well shaft, and there, tucked into a niche carved into the stone walls about 10 feet down, Tom found what they were looking for. An oiled leather pouch, carefully wrapped and preserved against moisture. Inside the pouch were Jake Hartwell's official papers, his federal marshal's commission, signed by the territorial governor, detailed reports documenting illegal land seizures. Across 3 counties, and most damning of all, a list of co-conspirators in the land fraud scheme, with Samuel Crenshaw's name at the top. "Look at this," Doc Williams said, studying one of the reports. Jake had documented at least 15 cases of fraudulent homestead claims, all involving properties with valuable water rights or mineral potential. Tom felt sick as he realized the true scope of what they'd destroyed. Jake Hartwell hadn't just been investigating Crenshaw. He'd been building a comprehensive case against an entire network of land grabbers who were stealing the future from honest settlers. "The posse that night," Tom said slowly. "How many of the men were part of Crenshaw's scheme?" Emma looked at him with those ancient, knowing eyes. "Papa thought some of them were. He said the corruption went deep, and that's why he had to be so careful about who he trusted." The revelation hit Tom like a thunderbolt. The raid on the Hartwell homestead hadn't been a tragic mistake. It had been a carefully orchestrated assassination, carried out by corrupt lawmen under the cover of legitimate law enforcement. "Emma," he said, his voice heavy with guilt and determination, "your father's work isn't finished. Someone needs to complete his investigation." Emma nodded gravely. "That's why Mama made me remember everything. She said someday someone would need to know the truth, so Papa's work wouldn't be for nothing." As they prepared to leave the homestead for the second time, Tom took one last look at the ruins of what had been a federal marshal's home and headquarters. Jake Hartwell had died trying to protect innocent people from the very corruption that had killed him. Now it was up to Tom to ensure that sacrifice hadn't been in vain. But first, he had to figure out which members of his own community might be part of the conspiracy that had destroyed the Hartwell family. The thought that some of his neighbors, people he'd trusted for 20 years, might have been complicit in murder made his stomach turn. Emma seemed to read his thoughts. "Papa always said the hardest part of being a lawman was learning that sometimes the badge doesn't make the man good. Sometimes bad men wear stars too." Looking at this child who had survived 20 years of hardship with her integrity intact, Tom realized he was about to learn just how deep that corruption ran in. His own community, Jake Hartwell's hidden journal, changed everything. Emma led them to the spot where her father lay buried, not in the town cemetery, but in an unmarked grave beneath a twisted oak tree about a mile from the homestead ruins. She'd been tending it secretly for years, placing wildflowers on the mound and keeping the weeds cleared away. "Papa made me promise to bury him here if anything happened," she explained as they dug carefully around the simple wooden marker she'd carved with a child's knife. "He said this tree was where he proposed to Mama, and he wanted to rest where they'd been happiest." Beside Jake's remains, wrapped in oiled cloth and protected by a metal box, they found his personal journal. The leather-bound book contained 3 years' worth of meticulous entries documenting the most extensive land fraud conspiracy in territorial history. Tom's hands shook as he read entry after entry detailing the scope of the corruption. Jake Hartwell had been investigating not just Samuel Crenshaw, but a network of land grabbers, corrupt officials, and complicit lawmen stretching across the entire territory. The scheme was breathtaking in its audacity. Identify valuable homesteads, manufacture evidence of criminal activity, use local law enforcement to remove or eliminate the legitimate owners, then claim the land through fraudulent transfers. "Listen to this," Doc Williams said, reading over Tom's shoulder. March 15, 1865, confirmed that Deputy Marshal Hoskins received payment from Crenshaw Associates for falsifying homestead abandonment reports. The corruption reaches into the Territorial Marshal's office itself. Emma sat quietly beside her father's grave, watching the adults grapple with the magnitude of what they'd discovered. "Papa knew he was in danger," she said. "That's why he taught me to read and write, so I could understand his work if something happened to him." Tom found an entry dated just 2 weeks before the raid. S. Crenshaw growing desperate. "My investigation has cut off 3 of his major land acquisition routes. Fear he may attempt direct action against my family. Have relocated most evidence to secure locations. If anything happens to me, the truth must survive." "Emma," Tom said gently, "can you read?" Emma nodded. "Papa taught me. I've read his journal many times over the years. That's how I knew what really happened that night and why it happened." The revelation hit Tom like a physical blow. This child, this 10-year-old girl, had understood the political conspiracy that led to her family's murder better than any of the adults involved. She'd spent 20 years not just surviving, but educating herself about the forces that had destroyed her world. "What else do you know?" Tom asked. Emma's response was delivered with the clinical precision of someone who'd studied the evidence for 2 decades. "The raid on our homestead wasn't a mistake or an accident. It was a planned assassination ordered by Samuel Crenshaw and carried out by corrupt lawmen who were part of his network. Some of the men in that posse knew exactly what they were doing." Doc Williams sat heavily on a fallen log. "You're saying some of our neighbors were deliberately involved in murdering a federal marshal?" Emma pulled out a folded paper from her dress pocket. Another document Tom hadn't seen before. Papa wrote down the names of the men he suspected were working with Crenshaw. "He hid it in my doll when he realized the raid was coming." Tom unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The list contained 8 names, 5 of which he recognized as members of the posse that had attacked the Hartwell homestead. Beside each name, Jake had written detailed notes about suspicious behavior, unexplained wealth, or connections to Crenshaw's operation. Frank Morrison's name was on the list, along with a note: "Acquired Jennings homestead 1 week after family abandoned it following harassment. Paid full price despite property being supposedly worthless." Walt Jenkins was there too, present at 3 separate raids on homesteads that later became part of Crenshaw Holdings, always volunteers for night operations. Most shocking of all was the last name on the list, Deputy Marshal Robert Hoskins, with the notation, "Confirmed taking bribes. Has access to territorial records and advance warning of federal investigations." "Hoskins," Tom said, the name bitter in his mouth. "He was the one who organized the posse. He's the one who told us about Crenshaw's evidence of outlaws at your homestead." Emma nodded gravely. "Papa suspected Deputy Hoskins was feeding information to the bad men. That's why Papa was working alone, without telling the Territorial Marshal's office about his investigation." The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Jake Hartwell had been conducting a covert investigation into territorial corruption. When he'd gotten too close to exposing the network, Crenshaw had used his inside information from Deputy Hoskins to orchestrate Jake's elimination. The raid had been planned as an assassination from the beginning, with legitimate lawmen like Tom serving as unwitting accomplices. "Dear God," Tom whispered, "we weren't just wrong about your father being a criminal. We were the criminals. We were the ones committing murder." Emma's voice was steady, but tears ran down her cheeks. "Papa knew some of you were good men who'd been tricked. That's why he told Mama to look for the Starman with the bent badge. He saw you trying to help during the fire. He knew you weren't one of the bad ones." Tom felt the weight of 20 years' guilt shift and transform into something else: determination. Jake Hartwell had died trying to expose corruption and protect innocent families. His investigation had been cut short by assassination, but his evidence had survived. Emma, your father's work isn't finished. This conspiracy, it's still active, isn't it? Emma nodded. Samuel Crenshaw died 10 years ago, but his son took over the business. He's been more careful, but he's still stealing land from honest folks. I've been watching him. You've been watching him. I grew up, Sheriff Bradley. I learned to track, to listen, to watch. I've spent years following the Crenshaw operation, documenting what they do. I have evidence Papa never lived to collect. Tom stared at this remarkable child who had transformed herself into an amateur detective. What kind of evidence? Emma reached into her other pocket and pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with careful handwriting. Property transfers, dates of harassment, names of families who abandoned valuable homesteads, connections between Crenshaw associates and local officials. I've been finishing Papa's work. Doc Williams leaned forward. Emma, you've been conducting your own investigation for 20 years. I had to, Emma said simply. Papa died before he could stop the bad men. Someone had to continue his work. Someone had to make sure they didn't hurt more families like they hurt mine. Tom felt a mixture of awe and heartbreak. This child had dedicated her entire life to seeking justice, not just for her own family, but for all the victims of the conspiracy that had destroyed her world. She had transformed her grief into purpose, her loss into a mission. The question now, Emma said, closing her notebook, is what we're going to do with what we know. The bad men are still out there, still hurting people, and some of the folks who helped kill Papa are still walking around Dust Creek like nothing ever happened. Tom looked at Jake Hartwell's grave, at the evidence of systematic corruption, at the child who had spent her life seeking justice. For 20 years, he'd carried guilt over a tragic mistake. Now he understood that what had happened wasn't a mistake at all. It was a crime, and some of the criminals were still at large. "We're going to finish your father's work," Tom said, his voice steady with resolve. "We're going to expose the whole conspiracy, and we're going to make sure justice is finally done." Emma smiled for the first time since he'd known her, a real smile that transformed her solemn face and reminded him that beneath the pain and premature wisdom, she was still a child who deserved to see her father's sacrifice mean something. "Papa would be proud," she said softly. "He always said the truth has a way of finding the light, no matter how deep people try to bury it." The federal marshal's badge lay in Tom's palm like a piece of fallen starlight. Emma had produced it from yet another hiding place, sewn into the lining of her father's old hat, the same hat she'd clutched through 20 years of wandering. The badge was tarnished but intact, its eagle and shield still clearly visible, along with the inscription, U.S. Marshal Jacob T. Hartwell, Commission 1863. "Papa always said this badge meant something more than just authority," Emma said, watching Tom examine the artifact. "He said it was a promise to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." Tom felt the weight of that promise settling on his shoulders. In 3 days, Dust Creek would hold its monthly town meeting. It was the perfect venue to reveal the truth about the Hartwell conspiracy, but it was also the most dangerous. If Emma's suspicions were correct, some of the people in that room would be co-conspirators in her father's murder. Doc Williams had spent the past 2 days quietly verifying Emma's evidence. Her notebook contained detailed documentation of at least 12 families who had lost their homesteads under suspicious circumstances over the past 20 years. The pattern was consistent: valuable properties, harassment campaigns, mysterious evidence of wrongdoing, and eventual forced abandonment or removal. "Look at this timeline," Doc said, spreading Emma's carefully drawn charts across Tom's desk. "Every major land seizure in the territory correlates with a property that had significant water rights or mineral potential. This wasn't random crime, it was systematic plunder." Martha had become Emma's fiercest advocate, providing the child with a safe place to stay and emotional support as she prepared to face the community that had unknowingly sheltered her family's killers. But even Martha was nervous about what might happen when the truth came out. Some folks in this town have built their prosperity on land that rightfully belonged to other families, Martha said. When Emma tells her story, she's not just asking for justice. She's threatening to expose 20 years of collective guilt. Tom understood the stakes. Revealing the truth about Jake Hartwell's murder wouldn't just vindicate one man's reputation. It would expose a network of corruption that had enriched some of Dust Creek's most prominent citizens. People who had bought stolen land, people who had profited from fraud, people who had looked the other way while their neighbors suffered. Frank Morrison had visited the jail twice since learning about the forged letter, each time more agitated than before. During his second visit, he'd made a confession that chilled Tom to the bone. "I knew something wasn't right about the Hartwell raid," Frank had admitted. Deputy Hoskins was too eager, too sure of himself, and afterward, when Crenshaw left town, "So quickly I wondered if we'd been played. But I had a family to think about, a reputation to protect. I convinced myself it was better to let sleeping dogs lie." "And the land you acquired afterward?" Tom had pressed. Frank's face had gone pale. "The Jennings place. Hoskins told me they'd abandoned it, that it was available for purchase. I needed good grazing land for my cattle, and the price was fair. I never asked too many questions about why they'd left." Now Frank was one of several former posse members wrestling with the knowledge that their silence had enabled 20 years of continued crime. Walt Jenkins had also come forward, admitting that he'd participated in 3 other raids based on Hoskins' information, all of which had resulted in families losing their homesteads. But not all of the conspirators were showing remorse. Young Samuel Crenshaw, son of the original mastermind, had learned about Emma's accusations and was taking active steps to protect his inherited empire. He'd visited Mayor Fletcher twice, pressuring him to prevent Emma from speaking at the town meeting. "This girl's claims are the ramblings of a disturbed child," Crenshaw had argued. "She's been living rough for years, probably suffering from delusions. If we let her disrupt our community with wild stories about ancient history, it could damage Dust Creek's reputation and economic prospects." Mayor Fletcher, caught between loyalty to his community and growing evidence of systemic corruption, had finally come to Tom with a proposal that revealed the depth of the moral crisis facing their town. "Tom, I've been thinking about this situation. With the Hartwell girl, what if we handle this quietly? Find her a good home somewhere else, maybe with relatives back east. Give her some money to start fresh, but avoid dragging the whole community through a painful public inquiry." Tom's response had been swift and unequivocal. "Harold, that girl's father was a federal marshal investigating the theft of territorial lands. He died trying to protect innocent families from criminals. We're not going to compound that injustice by silencing his daughter." But Fletcher's suggestion revealed the pressure building within the community. Some people genuinely wanted justice for the Hartwell family. Others were terrified of what that justice might cost them personally. Emma, meanwhile, had shown remarkable composure as she prepared for what might be the most important day of her life. She'd written out her statement carefully, documenting not just her family's story, but the broader pattern of corruption that had destroyed so many others. "I'm scared," she admitted to Tom the night before the town meeting. "Not of telling the truth, but of what happens if people don't want to hear it." "What do you mean?" Emma's expression was older than her years. "Papa used to say that sometimes people choose comfortable lies over difficult truths. If the bad men still have friends in this town, they might try to stop me from speaking." Tom had been wrestling with the same concern. Deputy Hoskins was long dead, but his network might still be active. Young Crenshaw certainly had the resources and motivation to silence Emma permanently. The thought of this brave child facing threats from the very people she was trying to expose made Tom's blood boil. Emma, I want you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, you've already honored your father's memory. You've preserved his work, documented the truth, and shown more courage than most adults manage in a lifetime." Emma clutched her father's martial badge, drawing strength from its weight and history. Papa always said that wearing a star was about making hard choices when easy ones would hurt innocent people. Tomorrow, I get to choose whether to stay quiet and safe or speak up for all the families who can't speak for themselves anymore. The irony wasn't lost on Tom. This child understood the meaning of law enforcement better than many of the men who'd worn badges in Dust Creek over the past 20 years. She embodied the principles her father had died defending: truth, justice, and protection of the innocent. As Tom made his final preparations for the town meeting, he realized that tomorrow would determine not just Emma's future, but the moral character of their entire community. Would Dust Creek choose to confront its painful past and commit to a more just future, or would it take the easier path of denial and complicity? He spent the evening writing his own statement, a full confession of his role in the Hartwell tragedy, along with everything he'd learned about the broader conspiracy. If Emma was going to risk everything for the truth, the least he could do was stand beside her. Martha stopped by near midnight, bringing coffee and moral support. "Tom, you know this could destroy you. Admitting your part in Jake Hartwell's death, revealing the corruption. You'll likely lose your badge, maybe face criminal charges." Tom looked at the badge on his chest, thinking of the promise Emma said it represented. "Martha, I've worn this star for 20 years, while carrying the weight of an innocent man's death. If losing it is the price of finally telling the truth, then it's a price worth paying." Outside, Dust Creek slept peacefully, unaware that tomorrow would bring a reckoning 20 years in the making. In the jail cell that had become her temporary home, Emma slept clutching her father's badge and Marshall's commission, the physical evidence of a lawman's interrupted mission. Tomorrow, she would finish what Jacob Hartwell had started. The truth would finally see the light, no matter how many people preferred the comfort of darkness. Tom spent the hours before dawn reading Jake Hartwell's journal one final time, preparing to honor a fellow lawman's sacrifice by ensuring his work would not be forgotten. The town meeting would determine whether justice was possible in Dust Creek, or whether corruption had taken such deep root that truth itself had become a threat to the community's survival. Either way, Emma Hartwell would have her day in court, a court of public opinion that had condemned her father 20 years ago without trial. This time, the evidence would be heard, the truth would be spoken, and a child's 20-year quest for justice would finally reach its conclusion. The gavel fell with the weight of 20 years of silence, finally breaking. Mayor Fletcher called the Dust Creek town meeting to order, but Tom could see the nervousness in his eyes as he surveyed the packed community hall. Every chair was filled, and people stood along the walls, drawn by rumors and whispered stories about the mysterious girl and her shocking claims about their sheriff's past. Emma sat in the front row beside Martha, her small hands folded carefully. In her lap, she wore a clean dress Martha had provided, and her hair was neatly braided, but nothing could disguise the gravity in her expression or the weight of purpose she carried. In her pocket, Tom knew, she held her father's Marshall badge and the evidence that would expose 20 years of lies. "Before we address regular business," Fletcher announced, his voice strained, "Sheriff Bradley has requested time to make a statement to the community." "Sheriff?" Tom stood, feeling every eye in the room focus on him. In the back, he could see Frank Morrison and Walt Jenkins, their faces pale with anticipation. Young Samuel Crenshaw sat near the middle, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes alert and calculating. "Friends and neighbors," Tom began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. 20 years ago, I participated in an action that has haunted me every day since. Tonight, it's time for the truth." He pulled out the homestead deed, Jake Hartwell's journal, and the forged letter that had started it all. One by one, he laid the evidence on the table before the community. In September 1865, I was part of a posse that raided the homestead of Jacob Hartwell. We believed we were acting on credible information that Hartwell was harboring criminals. We were wrong, completely devastatingly wrong. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people looked confused, others uncomfortable. Several residents who had been in Dust Creek during the early days exchanged worried glances. Jacob Hartwell was not a criminal, Tom continued, his voice growing stronger. He was a federal marshal conducting an investigation into territorial land fraud. The information that led to his death was fabricated by the very criminals he was investigating. Tom held up the forged letter. This document, signed by Samuel Crenshaw, contained false accusations designed to eliminate a federal officer who threatened Crenshaw's illegal operations. We didn't just make a mistake that night, we were manipulated into committing murder. The crowd erupted in shocked whispers and angry voices. Someone called out, "That's a serious accusation, Tom." Another voice demanded, "Where's your proof?" Tom gestured to Emma, who stood slowly and walked to the front of the room. Despite her small stature, she commanded immediate attention. The hall fell silent as she faced the community that had unknowingly sheltered her family's killers. "My name is Emma Hartwell," she said, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Jacob Hartwell was my father. Mary Hartwell was my mother. 20 years ago, some of you helped kill them." The silence was absolute now, broken only by the sound of shocked gasps and shifting chairs. Emma pulled out her father's marshal badge, holding it up so everyone could see. "My father was U.S. Marshal Jacob Hartwell, commissioned by the territorial government to investigate land fraud. He died trying to protect innocent families from criminals who were stealing their homes and futures." The badge caught the lamplight, its federal eagle clearly visible to the stunned crowd. Doc Williams stood up from his seat, his voice carrying the authority of someone the community trusted. "I've examined the evidence," he announced. "The Marshal's commission is authentic. The homestead deed proves the Hartwell family's legitimate claim to their land, and this child's account matches every detail of what I witnessed 20 years ago when I treated her dying mother." Young Samuel Crenshaw finally spoke up, his voice smooth but urgent. "This is preposterous, a child's fantasies, supported by old documents that could be forged. My father was a respected businessman who—" "Your father was a murderer," Emma interrupted, her voice cutting through Crenshaw's protests like a blade. "And I can prove it." She pulled out her notebook, the one filled with 20 years of careful documentation. "I've spent my whole life tracking the families your father destroyed. The Petersons, forced off their land after being accused of theft. The Washingtons, driven away after mysterious fires damaged their crops. The Murphys, who lost their homestead when they were falsely accused of harboring army deserters." Emma read name after name, date after date, building a methodical case that left the room in stunned silence. With each family she named, more people in the crowd began to remember, began to see the pattern they'd been blind to for 20 years. "All of these families lost valuable land," Emma continued. "Land with good water, good soil, or mineral rights. And in every case, Samuel Crenshaw or his associates ended up owning that land within months of the family's removal." Frank Morrison stood up, his face ashen. "She's right. The Jennings place I bought, Deputy Hoskins told me they'd abandoned it, but now I remember seeing smoke from their chimney just days before I acquired the deed. They didn't abandon it. They were driven off." Walt Jenkins rose next, his voice shaking. "The Crawford homestead. We raided it on Hoskins' orders, said they were hiding stolen cattle. Never found any cattle. But the family disappeared afterward. Crenshaw bought their land at auction 6 weeks later. The confessions rippled through the crowd like stones thrown into still water. One by one, men who had participated in the raids began to speak up, their voices heavy with the weight of 20 years' suppressed guilt. "Dear God," whispered Mayor Fletcher, "how many families did we destroy?" Emma's answer was delivered with devastating precision. "According to my father's investigation and my own documentation, at least 37 families lost their homes to this conspiracy. Some were driven away through harassment. Others were murdered, like my family was." She turned to face young Crenshaw directly. "Your father's network stole over 12,000 acres of territorial land. That's 12,000 acres of dreams, of futures, of families who came west, looking for honest opportunity, and found death and dispossession instead." Crenshaw's composure finally cracked. "Even if this were true, which I'm not admitting, it has nothing to do with me. I was a child when these alleged events occurred. I cannot be held responsible for continuing your father's work." Emma pulled out her most recent documentation. "The Henderson family was driven off their land just 3 years ago. False accusations of cattle rustling, followed by a convenient foreclosure when they couldn't pay the legal fees to defend themselves. You bought their property at auction for 1/10 of its value." The room erupted in angry voices as people realized the conspiracy had not died with Samuel Crenshaw, but had continued under his son's leadership. The corruption they thought was ancient history was still active, still destroying families in their own time. Tom stepped forward, raising his hands for quiet. "The question now is what we do with this knowledge. We can choose to ignore the truth, to protect our comfortable lies. Or we can choose justice, even when it's difficult and painful." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of neighbors and friends who would have to decide whether their community had the courage to confront its own complicity in systematic murder and theft. Emma Hartwell has spent 20 years seeking justice for her family and for all the other victims of this conspiracy. The question before us tonight is simple. Do we have the moral courage to give her that justice? The gavel lay silent on Mayor Fletcher's table, waiting for a community to decide whether truth mattered more than convenience, whether justice was worth the price of confronting their own painful history. The ballot box sat on Mayor Fletcher's table like a silent judge, waiting to receive the votes that would determine whether Dust Creek chose justice or complicity. Young Samuel Crenshaw had made one final desperate attempt to sway the community, offering to fund a new school and improve the main road, if they would let bygones be bygones and focus on the future instead of relitigating ancient history. His words fell flat in the face of Emma's documented evidence and the mounting confessions from former posse members. "This isn't ancient history," Martha declared, standing to address the crowd. "This is about who we are as a community. Are we people who profit from murder and theft? Or are we people who stand up for what's right, even when it costs us?" Doc Williams had taken the floor next, his medical authority lending weight to his words. "I've known this child for weeks now. I've examined her evidence, verified her documents, and listened to her story. Emma Hartwell is telling the truth, and we have a moral obligation to act on that truth." But the community remained divided. Several residents who had purchased land from Crenshaw over the years were visibly distressed, realizing their property might have been acquired through fraud. Others worried about the economic impact of exposing the conspiracy, fearing it might discourage new settlers or bring unwanted attention from territorial authorities. Tom watched the debate with growing recognition that this moment would define not just Emma's future, but the moral character of their entire community. When Mayor Fletcher finally called for the vote, Tom felt the weight of 20 years, accumulated guilt and hope, pressing down on his shoulders. All those in favor of pursuing formal investigation and justice regarding the allegations against the Crenshaw land fraud conspiracy, please deposit a white ballot, Fletcher announced. Those opposed, please use the black ballots. One by one, the residents of Dust Creek approached the ballot box. Tom watched faces he'd known for decades, trying to read their intentions. Frank Morrison and Walt Jenkins cast their votes quickly, their expressions grim but determined. Martha voted without hesitation, her jaw set with resolve. Young Crenshaw voted as well, his confident demeanor suggesting he believed his wealth and influence would ultimately protect him. Several of his known associates followed suit, their votes presumably cast to maintain the status quo. The tension in the room was palpable as Fletcher and two volunteers began counting the ballots. Emma sat perfectly still, her small hands folded around her father's marshal badge. Tom realized this child had shown more courage in one evening than most adults managed in a lifetime. "The count is complete," Fletcher announced, his voice strained. 47 votes cast. 23 in favor of investigation and justice, 23 opposed. A murmur of shock ran through the crowd. After all of Emma's evidence, all the confessions, all the documented proof of systematic murder and fraud, the community was perfectly split. One ballot remains uncounted, Fletcher continued, his face pale. According to our town charter, in case of a tie vote on matters of community justice, the deciding ballot belongs to the senior elected official. He looked at Tom. "Sheriff Bradley, as the longest-serving law enforcement officer in Dust Creek, the final decision rests with you." Tom felt every eye in the room focus on him. This was the moment he'd been dreading and anticipating for 20 years. The chance to finally make amends for his role in the Hartwell tragedy, or to protect himself and his community by maintaining the comfortable lie they'd all lived with. He thought of Jake Hartwell, dying in the flames while trying to protect his family. He thought of Mary Hartwell, using her final breaths to ensure her daughter would remember the truth. He thought of Emma, spending 20 years in pursuit of justice, not just for herself, but for all the victims of the conspiracy that had destroyed her world. Tom walked slowly to the ballot box, aware that his decision would echo through history. In his hand, he held both a white ballot and a black one, justice or convenience, truth or comfortable fiction, the choice that would define the rest of his life. He looked at Emma one final time, seeing in her young face the same determination and integrity that had driven her father to investigate corruption, even when it cost him his life. She met his gaze steadily, not pleading or demanding, but simply trusting him to make the right choice. Tom dropped the white ballot into the box. 24 votes in favor of justice, Fletcher announced, his voice barely audible. "The motion carries." The room erupted in a mixture of cheers and angry protests. Young Crenshaw shot to his feet, his face flushed with rage. "This is a travesty. You're destroying the economic foundation of this community based on the fantasies of a disturbed child." But his protests were drowned out by the sound of applause from those who had chosen truth over comfort. Frank Morrison and Walt Jenkins approached Crenshaw, their faces set with determination. "Samuel Crenshaw," Frank said formally, "by the authority of this community vote, you're under citizen's arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and murder. You'll be held pending investigation by territorial authorities." Emma stood slowly, still clutching her father's badge. For the first time since Tom had found her, she smiled, a real smile that transformed her solemn face and reminded everyone present that justice, however delayed, could still be served. "Papa," she whispered, looking up toward the ceiling as if her father could hear her. "I kept my promise. I told them the truth." 6 months later, the sound of children's laughter echoed across the rebuilt Hartwell homestead. Emma stood in the doorway of the new cabin, watching a group of young students practice their letters on slate boards under the shade of the same twisted oak tree where her father lay buried. The federal investigation had concluded with Samuel Crenshaw's conviction and the recovery of most of the stolen lands. The territorial government had awarded Emma full ownership of her family's original homestead as part of the restitution, along with additional compensation for the 20 years of hardship she'd endured. But Emma had chosen to use her settlement differently than anyone expected. Instead of selling the land and moving to a comfortable life in a distant city, she decided to fulfill her father's interrupted mission by establishing a school for the children of families who had lost their homesteads to the conspiracy. The rebuilt cabin served as both her home and the classroom where she taught reading, writing, and the importance of standing up for justice, even when it seemed impossible. Tom Bradley no longer wore a sheriff's badge. The territorial court had been lenient in his sentencing, recognizing his cooperation and genuine remorse, but had ruled that his participation in Jake Hartwell's death disqualified him from continuing in law enforcement. Instead, he'd found a new purpose as Emma's assistant and the school's groundskeeper, tending the vegetable garden and maintaining the property while helping Emma with her teaching duties. The work was humble, but it gave Tom something he'd never expected to find: peace. Every day, he watched Emma transform the site of her family's tragedy into a place of learning and hope. Her resilience and determination had shown him that redemption was possible, even for someone who carried the weight of terrible mistakes. "Mr. Bradley," called out young Timothy Fletcher, the mayor's grandson, "Miss Emma says you know stories about the old days. Will you tell us about the real lawmen, the ones who fought the bad men?" Tom smiled, settling onto a wooden stump that served as his usual storytelling spot. Over the months, he'd become the keeper of local history, but his stories always emphasized the importance of justice, truth, and protecting innocent people. "Well now," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of a natural storyteller, "let me tell you about a federal marshal named Jacob Hartwell, who was brave enough to stand up to corruption even when it put his family in danger." Emma paused in her lesson to listen, as she always did when Tom told her father's story. She'd heard it dozens of times, but it never failed to bring tears to her eyes and pride to her heart. Her father's sacrifice had not been in vain. His work lived on in every child who learned to read and write in the school built on his land. The legal proceedings had taken months to resolve completely. Frank Morrison and Walt Jenkins had testified willingly about their roles in the conspiracy, receiving reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation. Several other former posse members had come forward voluntarily, adding their voices to the growing record of the systematic fraud that had plagued the territory for decades. The recovered lands had been returned to surviving family members where possible. In cases where entire families had been killed or had disappeared, the property was sold and the proceeds used to establish a fund for territorial orphans and displaced families. Emma had insisted on this arrangement, understanding that justice meant healing the entire community, not just addressing her personal grievances. Doc Williams had become Emma's unofficial guardian, though she had proven herself remarkably independent. At Martha's suggestion, the community had built a small apartment above the general store, where Emma stayed during the winter months when the school was closed. But she always returned to the homestead come spring, drawn by the connection to her parents and her mission to honor their memory. Young Samuel Crenshaw had received a 20-year sentence for continuing his father's criminal enterprise, with the possibility of parole if he made full restitution to his victims. Several of his associates had fled the territory rather than face prosecution, but territorial marshals were still tracking them down. The corruption network that had operated with impunity for 2 decades was finally being dismantled. Piece by piece, Martha had become the school's biggest supporter, organizing fundraising events and ensuring Emma had everything she needed for her students. The saloon keeper had found a new purpose in supporting education, often joking that teaching children to read was probably better for the community than serving whiskey to their fathers. Mayor Fletcher had initially worried about the economic impact of the scandal, but the territorial government's investment in rebuilding had actually improved Dust Creek's prospects. The town was now known as a place where justice had triumphed over corruption, attracting honest settlers and legitimate businesses. As the afternoon sun began to set, Emma dismissed her students for the day and walked to her parents' gravesite. She'd added a proper headstone for her father, inscribed with his name, dates, and the simple phrase, U.S. Marshal Jacob Hartwell. He died protecting the innocent. Tom found her there, as he often did at the end of each school day. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of gold and amber. "Do you think Papa would be proud of what we've built here?" Emma asked as Tom looked at the thriving school, the well-tended garden, the children walking home with their lessons fresh in their minds. He thought of the families who had been reunited with stolen land, the corruption that had been exposed and eliminated, the justice that had finally been served. "Emma," he said with absolute certainty, "your father would be proud beyond words. You didn't just honor his memory. You completed his mission. You turned a place of tragedy into a place of hope." Emma smiled, clutching the marshal badge she still carried every day. "Mama always said the truth has a way of finding the light. No matter how deep people try to bury it, I guess she was right." As darkness fell over the homestead, lights began to appear in the windows of Dust Creek, where families gathered for dinner and children shared the lessons they'd learned at the Hartwell School. The town that had once profited from lies and violence had chosen a different path, guided by a child's unwavering commitment to justice and an old sheriff's determination to make amends for the mistakes of his past. The truth had indeed found the light, and in that light, healing had finally begun.